After holding informal referenda last week, pro-Russian insurgents in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions have declared independence. Ukraine's transitional government and its Western allies have rejected the results, instead looking towards Ukraine's fast-approaching presidential elections in the hopes that the democratic process will bring stability back to the country. For more now on the future of Ukraine, we welcome Helena Yakovlev-Golani, research scholar at the Munk School of Global Affairs, Ihor Kozak, former Canadian military officer and diplomat, and Seva Gunitsky, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. And Helena, we're happy to have you back on the program. And to our other two guests, first time here, nice to have you here with us. Let's just sit tight for a second because we're going to go through some stuff. Map, please. Let's bring up the map control room because a lot of people won't know what part of the world we're talking about here. These are eastern Ukrainian regions. There's the country, Donetsk and Luhansk, hugging the border with Russia. That's about 6.6 million population in that part of the world. And let's now show you the so-called referenda, as Ihor calls them, held by pro-Russian insurgents this Sunday. Those are the numbers in favor of sovereignty in Donetsk, almost 90%, in Luhansk, above 90%. And then let's compare the results of that to a recent survey conducted by the Pew Research Center in eastern Ukraine in April. And they asked citizens what they wanted the future of their country to be like. 70% saying they wanted it to remain united, only 18% saying they would be content having regions secede. Okay, let's pick up on that. Helena, the people who organized and participated in these referenda, who are they?
Well, in general, these are pro-Russian supporters, but we can talk only about 30% of them. All these people who we watch on TV standing in lines, they're basically 30% of the population, and the majority didn't really participate in this so-called referendum. It didn't exercise their so-called right to vote because of the two reasons. First of all, the reason they were scared, some of them.
Scared of what?
Scared of military militia, which were roaming about the streets. Right. And the second reason I see is that some of them perceive it as illegitimate referendum, and that's why they, with predicted results, and that's why they don't really see any incentive to participate.
How legitimate do you see the results of these referenda being?
Well, they're clearly illegitimate, and I think even some Russians would agree with that. And the question here is not really of legitimacy, but what it represents. And it represents a real sentiment among a proportion of the ethnic Russian population that feels very uneasy with the current Kiev government.
Any legitimacy in your eyes to these referenda?
Well, obviously it is not legit, as authorities of Kiev stated, authorities internationally and even Russians, as Seva pointed out, for example, Ilya Ponomarev, the Russian member of Duma, or activist pro-democracy as Andrei Buzin, speak in the Moscow press conference for reasons being, as Helena stated, there is armed folks who control this. There was even a footage in the National Post day before the referendum here in the video on their website that showed the 3 armed men, heavily armed, who were caught, and in their trunk there were 100,000 ballots or bulletins who already been pre-checked pro-independence. So we're telling you that it's been staged, and there is absolutely no way to independently verify it whatsoever.
How, Helena, would you compare these latest, again, so-called referenda to the annexation of Crimea in terms of legitimacy?
Well, what we saw in Crimea is what I call occupandum. This is occupandum.
Okay.
Because you have two interpretations. The first one is when you have an occupation through referendum or a referendum during occupation. These two models were used in Crimea. And now we see a different kind of occupation by locals who are clearly supported by the Russians, but also in general by oligarchs, Ukrainian oligarchs. Some of them we know, Rinat Akhmetov, for example. But what remains to be seen if Russia will proceed with this referendum and will actually occupy this territory. I think it's unlikely, because what Russians would likely to do is turn this area into some kind of Transnistria. It's a pro-Russian enclave in Moldova, so they can control other parts of Ukraine through this area.
Do you see these two parts of Ukraine unfolding their future in the same way?
Yeah, I don't think Putin wants those regions to actually become part of Russia. They do want a degree of autonomy, but if they actually strive to become a part of Russia, it will be a huge financial drain on Russia, and I don't think they're in a position to afford that kind of financial drain. Also, if Russia actually manages to split up Ukraine in that way, it will mean a very hostile Western Ukraine. So I don't think Putin wants those regions to necessarily come over to the Russian side too quickly. I think he wants them to be in this limbo, this Transnistria limbo that you talked about, where they exercise enough influence to have some degree of control over the territory.
You're from Russia, yes,
I
originally?
am. Yes.
It's always a bit dangerous assuming you know how Mr. Putin thinks, though, isn't it?
Absolutely. The foreign policy apparatus is very opaque. And that's part of the reason why events have unfolded in such a surprising way, escalating very quickly. So we don't really know what's driving Putin. We don't know how much the security forces are pushing him. We tend to conflate Russian foreign policy with Putin's foreign policy. And I don't think that's necessarily a justifiable assumption.
Not necessarily the same thing all the time.
That's right.
I see. Okay. Igor, how about this notion of whether or not we will see more, again, to use your term, so-called referenda happening in other regions of eastern Ukraine? Do you see that happening?
I believe it's going to, obviously we don't know yet. It depends what happens in Luhansk, in Donetsk, what the outcome is, how it's going to be handled in that situation. I believe if situation unfolds as being more destabilized, that pro-Russian forces and forces who are controlling this to a certain degree from Moscow, who orchestrate from Kremlin, they will be encouraged to do this, to move further to other regions of eastern Ukraine. But if it's stopped, then I believe that we will have a stabilizing situation in Ukraine, and hopefully with presidential elections coming up. And obviously, as Sava said and my colleague said, it's evolving situation. We cannot sit here and predict exactly what will happen.
Well, having said that, I'm going to ask anyway. Helena, what do you think? More referenda on the way?
No, I don't think so, because for two reasons. Because other people follow the events and they don't want to share the fate of Slavyansk. And another one, you know, if you look at the recent reactions of the Russians, they don't really support and they don't jump and proclaim independence and that they recognize independence of these two self-proclaimed areas, territories. So I don't think it's a good indication for others in the area.
Igor, let me ask you about that. Do you think these two so-called breakaway republics or areas, whatever you want to call them, could they survive as independent states?
I believe not. I mean, as we discussed prior to this interview, I recently came from Ukraine. I'm returning back. I'm in constant touch with folks on the ground. So notwithstanding all the pro-Kremlin or Kremlin propaganda, the absolute majority of folks, at least I interacted with, and your statistic supports this, they do not want to break away from Ukraine. They want to be part of Ukraine. They want to stabilize the situation. They want to have a peaceful resolution here.
Do you agree that these parts of Ukraine actually, never mind the results of this so-called referenda, actually want to stay part of Ukraine?
I think there's a deep sense of unease about the situation, but the feeling there is ambivalent. I don't think they want to jump to either side. They want to assure a degree of stability. The conflict here is not really between Russia and the West or Ukraine and Russia. It's between ordinary people who want to go about their lives and be left out of these politics versus zealots from both sides who are pushing an agenda aggressively, claiming to represent the interests of the people who don't really follow those beliefs.
The zealots seem to be in ascension right now. They seem to have the upper hand.
Unfortunately, yes. This kind of political economic instability is fertile ground for right-wing parties. If you look at European history, this kind of situation is very conducive to the rise of right-wing parties. So hopefully that will not be the case here.
You wanted to say?
Actually, in this particular case, I disagree with Sava because coming from eastern Ukraine and traveling right across, I haven't seen much of the so-called fascist radicals from the West. They are doing much over there. It's a situation being destabilized by the local criminal elements, by opportunists who want to seize the moment here, and is being destabilized, I believe, controlled from Moscow. This situation is also being described as such by President Obama, for example, and me coming from the military background, I can tell you that such reports are always backed by concrete intelligence, by analysis, and therefore I don't think it's just a very random situation here, and I haven't seen, as I said, much of the radicals from the West or some sort of fascists destabilizing this. It's actually coming from Moscow with the local radicals, with the local opportunist criminals seizing the moment as well.
Helena,
Can I
as you...
respond to that?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead and then here.
So you're right in the sense that the right-wing nationalists are a small minority in Ukraine. They got something like 1% of the vote in the 2007 elections. But in the 2012 elections, they received 10% of the votes. So there's no doubt that there's a growth in that kind of sentiment. I don't think they're running the show by any means. And Russian propaganda, which portrays them all as pro-Ukrainian nationalists, I think is completely false. But that said, I also think it's wrong to portray Putin as this sinister creature who has his tentacles in every corner of eastern Ukraine and manipulating these militants. I think some of them are simply local agents, criminals, as you put it,
sure,
who are stepping
into
the
situation.
Exactly, stepping into the power vacuum and taking advantage of the situation.
Helena.
I think that I would agree and disagree with both of our guests, and I just wanted to add that I agree with Seva that you have locals on the ground that are financed by a local oligarch, as I said, Rinat Akhmetov. And we have a testimony from the People's Republic governor, Pavel Gubarev, who told that 2/3 of the separatists were actually financed by Akhmetov. And Akhmetov does it it's a very fortunate situation for him in a sense that he can negotiate better deal with the central government in Kiev to ensure his business interests in eastern Ukraine.
Which are what? His business interests?
Business interest, he's a billionaire. Almost every industry in eastern Ukraine belongs to him, so it is in his interest to at least to have this kind of wealth and ensure its prosperity.
Ihor, before Yanukovych left the scene,
correct,
while he was still in power in Ukraine, in your view, how much attention did he actually pay to the eastern part of his country?
Well, obviously, he didn't pay enough. As we all know, Yanukovych and his entourage, they're coming from criminal background. They're oligarchs who stripped the country of the riches. And notwithstanding all the rhetoric that we hear time after time during presidential elections, parliamentary elections, when the party region would talk about supporting their own electorate, they in reality did very little. If you travel across the eastern Ukraine and you see the poverty, you see the issues, you see how little money was spent on the regular folks, I mean, it's obvious that that wasn't the case. They did very little.
All right. In which case, let me put these numbers up here. Again, control room, if we can. This again from the Pew survey. Here's what Eastern Ukrainians thought about the influence the new interim government in Kiev was having on the way things are going in Ukraine. And you can see the results are not encouraging. A good influence, only 24%. 2/3 of those surveyed saying that this new interim government was having a bad influence. So perhaps I can get Seva to comment on this first. How do Eastern Ukrainians feel about the way power is distributed within Ukraine today?
Well, clearly there's a significant proportion of the population that feels left out of the interim government. That said, the interim government has been commendably moderate so far. But I do think, and Ihor will probably disagree with me on this, that the right wing is overrepresented in the interim government. The moderate parties have tended to stay away, because they feel that if they participate in this government now, they will be blamed for whatever happens next. So my real hope, my true hope, is that the right-wingers do not get a larger share of the vote in the May 25th elections, and that the moderate parties will step in.
Ihor, where do you think public opinion is now?
Well, I think, starting with your results, I would take it with a grain of salt, specifically because we talk, for example, before the show that Ukrainian people, Russian people, and Eastern Europe people historically are very skeptical of any governments, whether it was under Russian Empire, Austro-Hungarian Empire, Soviet Union, Germany. People have a tendency to stick together, rely on themselves, and question anything that the government does. So I'm not surprised by those results. The interim government been in power for a very short period, and I think they tried their best. And Seva is right, I tend to disagree. I believe the whole nationalistic part, or perhaps the chauvinistic, as the Russians, RT television would call it, the so-called neo-Nazis, I'm yet to see them. I mean, I'm working with various groups. I'm working with Ukrainian Jews. I'm working with the Muslim Tatars. And there is not much of that, fascism that is being displayed there. So once again, I believe it's a Russian propaganda, and it's not justifiable.
Fair to say, Helena, that there are other regions in eastern Ukraine which are more amenable to the interim government?
I think there is a chance to mend these relations, because if we look at the situation right now, we see that interim government sometimes uses threats more than carrots, let's say. And they have to, I'm not here to give any advice or piece of advices to the interim government. They know better than I, but what they should prepare, they should give some kind of plan, concrete plan of how they're going to improve the lives of these people. They have to address the grievances.
Absolutely. Well, I think the acting Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has said he's open to amending the Constitution to making everybody feel a bigger part of it.
Yes, but still they are threatening with courts and they putting people in jail. So they have to somehow balance these two and win back the trust of these people.
Seva, are there separatists who don't want to join Russia?
Absolutely. There's a spectrum of opinion, and there's a lot of ambivalence. Some of them just want more autonomy within Ukraine. Some want a de facto republic of some sort. Others want outright annexation with Russia. I think all of that is a symptom of the fact that there's a deep sense of unease about the future of the country. And there's no short-term solution for that, even with a well-run election.
So is the rest of the world overly focusing on punishing Russia, even though the facts on the ground may not call for that?
Absolutely. I think the West made a huge mistake after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, thinking that the best way to de-escalate the situation is to punish Russia. And this is almost a Cold War mentality, saying Russia escalated the situation, which is true, so the best way to de-escalate is to put pressure on Putin and force him to back down. And that's a fundamental misreading of the situation, because the best way to punish Putin, the best way to limit Putin's influence in the region is to ensure a stable and united Ukraine. And I don't think the West has done enough to push the interim Ukrainian government to ensure that they have an inclusive community.
You're smiling because you know he's going to disagree
Absolutely.
with you. Okay,
Well, that's the whole
bring
point
it on.
of discussion.
Bring it on.
Well,
Yeah.
clearly I agree there is a difficult situation, but let's go back to the basics. In 1994, Ukraine gave up the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. In Budapest, a memorandum was signed. Russia, United States, United Kingdom guaranteed sovereignty, independence, integrity of Ukrainian territory. Now, Russia, contrary to all the international treaties, this one inclusive, violates this, occupies Ukrainian territory in Crimea. What is the West supposed to do? Clearly, they have to act on this memorandum. They have to send a message. If we don't, forget Ukrainian aside, European stability and security aside, what kind of message are we sending to Iran, to North Korea, to anybody else around the world on the geopolitical level? Therefore, I believe the reaction should happen. Now we're talking about east and south of Ukraine, but everybody is forgetting or pretend to forget that Ukrainian territory is occupied Crimea, occupied by Russian forces, and Russia has no desire to give it back whatsoever.
Well, having said that, let me try this with you, Helena, and that is, unlike Crimea, which clearly Russia was interested in, Putin has shown no interest in annexing these two provinces which, allegedly voted to join him. What's going on there?
I agree, and I see only maybe three main reasons why he acted as he acted. The first one, probably he hasn't decided yet what to do. What he does know is that he doesn't want to annex the whole area, Donbass area, because Crimea now is a very big economic burden for Russia, and they have to deal with it right now. The second reason that I see is maybe they try to distance themselves from this crisis and to present or reintroduce themselves as a neutral player in this conflict.
A neutral player?
A neutral player.
That will take some skill.
That's true, but that's how they see it.
Okay.
And what they want actually is just to postpone these further sanctions, right? They are not interested in a new cycle of sanctions. So they try to distance themselves from the whole mass and saying, okay, these are locals and we have no influence whatsoever.
Okay.
The third reason is when we have talks with China on May 2021, and you have very important for Russia, very important deals in financial and energy sector. And Russia doesn't want to do anything that would jeopardize these talks. They need these energy deals, especially in light of Western sanctions. And another thing that Putin wants to test waters with Merkel and Hollande on June 6th in
Germany
France.
and France.
Yes, with Germany and France. So it will be interesting. So he wants to postpone any critical decision till then, and just to see how it works out.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left here, and let's touch on one last thing. We know on the 25th of May, I know all the talk in Ontario is of an election on June 12th. Well,
Right.
before that,
It's important too.
before that, on May 25th, they're going to have presidential elections in Ukraine. I want to know how hopeful all of you are that those elections will actually bring additional legitimacy to the current situation. What do you think, Seba?
Well, a lot hinges on the outcome of the elections. There are two major problems. The first obstacle is to actually run a smooth election. That is a big if. There's been a lot of interference and violence in the eastern regions. I think whatever happens, the results will not be declared legitimate by some of the people in those regions.
Sure.
Secondly, even if the elections do run smoothly, which is a big if, there's the danger that the results will be declared invalid by Russians if they feel that Russian interests aren't represented, which they're not likely to be. So I think even if elections do run smoothly, there's still a lot of risks involved. And just to pick up on China, I'm glad you brought that up because nobody's been mentioning it. China is the country that's really benefiting from all of this for two reasons. One is it's been taking away attention from China's own conflicts in the South China Sea. Europe and the West in general have zeroed in on Russia. And secondly, as you've mentioned, it allows China to force Russia to sign better gas deals. It has more leverage if it knows that Russia is frightened of being pushed out of the European Union.
Okay, forgive me, Ihor, we're down to our last 30 seconds. How hopeful are you these presidential elections will matter?
I believe they need to happen. I need to have a legitimate government in place. As for Russia, well, I believe Putin will declare them not legitimate regardless what happens. We are moving in the right direction, I believe, and I'm happy that OSCE and international community is supporting this, sending 5,000 or so observers. It's a step in the right direction. Challenging, as Sava said, but a step in the right direction.
And you're going to be there too?
Absolutely.
Okay. We thank all three of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Thanks so much to Helena Yakovlev-Golani from the Monk School, Ihor Kozak, the former Canadian military officer and diplomat, Sava Gunitsky, the professor of political science at the University of Toronto. Great discussion, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.